This last segment is about the recent changes to the OAIS reference model. These are some of the problems, questions, which we sought to address and which came up during the periodic review of OAIS. Following slides address each of these in turn. Of course, we thought it necessary to clarify the general types of actions which an archive would carry out to preserve something. So this is not at the very detailed level, but just a very broad brush type of activities. We believe that a complete set of options may then be described as follows. Here are the, so we often hear emulate or migrate, but that's too limited. The current OAIS is sometimes thought of, or can be read as emphasizing migration, but implicitly it has lots of other options. The new draft aims to make the various techniques explicit. So we can have a look at this. The object may be kept in the archive, but the bits may be changed. So that might be in that mantra migrate, but it is a little rather more complicated than that. Or the object may be kept in the archive, but the bits are kept unchanged. Maybe that's emulate, but there are a lot more than that. Or in the last resort, if the archive cannot preserve the object, then it's not kept in the archive but handed over to another archive. So we can then work through these to get essentially a logically exhaustive list of preservation techniques. So for the first, we have transform the content data object, the object that the data that's being preserved, and that means changing the representation information, checking that the way that the transformation has happened is adequate by looking at the transformational information properties and so forth. In case 2, if the bits stay the same but the designated community knowledge base changes, then one needs to add representation information. An emulator is one type of representation information, but there are many more types. And finally, in case 3, the archive must hand over a complete archival information package that has everything needed to preserve the information. And this is related to the OAIS interoperability framework. So that, I believe, gives an exhaustive list of the types of activities. At any one point, the archive can choose which is the best option. So we talked about representation information, how much should be provided at any one time. I should point out that libraries and other document archives, and maybe even web archives, find this confusing sometimes. What should they provide? Well, we make it clear that in OAIS, the new version, that the initial amount of representation information required may be very minimal. For example, a library's designated community may be people who can read and understand the language the documents are written in, or indeed display and use the web pages, and of course have access to the appropriate software such as PDF readers or indeed web browsers. So at the moment, the library or web archive does not need to provide very much, if any, representation information. For a specific data object, in other words, and a specific designated community, the knowledge base of that designated community may be adequate for its members to understand and use the data object. In such cases, the representation information could just be a statement that no additional representation information is needed for that specific designated community at that specific time, but further representation information may be needed to be collected in future. The revised text goes on to say, any representation information that can be gathered at ingest or before should be included, since it will likely be costlier to rediscover and add it at a later time. Again, related to representation information, we thought it best to allow an archive to clarify what it expects in terms of understandability and usability. And so we've defined preservation objectives. For example, for a simple document, the example is the ability to render it or display it or to play it. And there are various ways that that can be verified, depending on how detailed one wants it to be. For data, one might expect to talk about how to generate results using that data, and that can be checked by comparison with what has been generated earlier. So these are quite specific preservation objectives to test what is meant by understandability and usability. Then there are a set of issues to do with how the PDI, Preservation Description Information components, are about the content information. And conceptually, this is fine. There's nothing wrong with OAIS as it is. But an information object is a data object plus its representation information, which could be a full representation information network. Consequently, the provenance, for example, of that thing could be quite difficult to capture. I mean, it could be captured in principle. I could imagine ways, but that's not described in OAIS. Therefore, what we decided to do is to change the definition of provenance and the other components of PDI to refer to the data object rather than the information object. Remember that representation information refers to the data object, so in that sense we've made things more consistent. It's certainly easier to implement, and to be honest, this is what all the archives I know about currently do. So we've made life easier to be consistent. So this is the, just to illustrate the change, this is the 2012 version of all the components of an archival information package. What we're doing is to put this arrow down to the data object, and we add that it is important to apply reference, fixity, provenance, context, and access rights to representation information itself, because it is an information object, and it may well be preserved. We'll come back to that, or to any other representation, any other information the archive is preserving. So that's the change. It's going down to data object instead of information object. We also have looked at the information package, and when you read it, it does seem to imply that you do need PDI in that information package, although we have here a star, which could mean any amount, including 0 PDI, but more importantly, we have content information here, which is what is being preserved, and we want to be able to apply packages more generally, as we'll see in OAIS-IF. So we change this in the following way, from this to this, which looks really quite different, but in fact you can easily see that this does not change what, for example, an archival information package is, simply because an information object may be all of these things which make up an archival information package contents. In other words, all of these things make up the information object of an AIP. So we can change the definition, the basic definition of information package, to be more usable, especially for OAIS-IF, without compromising the existing definitions of archival information package. We describe in OAIS the various things an archive must define, such as designated community and now preservation objectives and so forth. But these are not in the AIP, because transferring an AIP to another archive could mean that these things change. The other archive may have a different designated community. Therefore, we show how long each definition should be kept. So as long as the objects are being preserved by the archive, you obviously need the designated community, preservation objectives, transformational information properties. When the object's transferred, if and when the object's transferred to another archive, these things may change. They may be the same, but they may change. And as long as any specific packaging structure, in particular the AIP structure, is in use, then the packaging information for the AIP must be preserved, and which of course must be sent over if the AIP is transferred to another archive. And the relationships between editions and versions of AIPs should also be kept, as long as a specific AIP structure is being kept by the archive. Other information may be useful while these various services of filing, ordering and so forth are in use, and in particular the packaging of SIPs and DIPs. In summary, the updates to OAIS should help archives in their work of preserving information. For many of the archives, these changes will not require them to change what they do, although some aspects may need to be documented or better documented. The changes, of course, have an impact on ISO 16363, and that's also being updated. And the changes to the information package in particular make the OAIS-IF standards, which you heard about, more consistent with the OAIS terminology. So I'll end there, and we can open up to questions on these updates to OAIS. Thank you.